Peter Sutcliffe is one of the most infamous killers in British history. For 5 years he evaded capture while brutally murdering 13 young women across the north of England. It was an investigation with twists and turns and a case that still haunts the British public to this day.
For years, women and girls felt that simply leaving their homes at night meant taking their lives in their hands.
When Sutcliffe was eventually apprehended on January the 2nd, 1981, it brought an end to a manhunt that had both terrified and captivated the nation. The press had dubbed him the Yorkshire Ripper.
For women, it was a very frightening time, and they were stuck in this awful position of being told they shouldn't go out at night. It had an enormous social effect on the country.
As well as his 13 victims, Sutcliffe had attacked at least 7 more women. His arrest was a huge relief for the under-pressure detectives at West Yorkshire Police.
He attacked at random. We couldn't anticipate his moves. The whole of the north of England was held in a grip of terror, really, by this man. There was a sort of, I can only describe it as a Gothic-type cloud over the area.
But the Yorkshire Ripper's story begins over 70 years ago. Peter Sutcliffe was born on the 2nd of June 1946 in the market town of Bingley on the outskirts of Bradford, West Yorkshire.
He was the youngest of quite a large family. His brothers and sisters were all of strong character. They were all working class, could look after themselves. But Peter was a shy boy and very much attached to his mother.
His mother was somebody who was very much dominated and controlled by his father. So I think he had quite a lot of sympathy for his mum, and he thought the world of her as a child. But Peter was somebody who was quite shy, quite awkward, he was quite skinny and scrawny. And I don't think he ever lived up to his father's expectations. And I think that planted that seed of shame in Peter Sutcliffe that would come to shape the rest of his life.
Sutcliffe's awkward demeanour as a child manifested into a dysfunctional adulthood, demonstrated in his early career choices.
Peter Sutcliffe had a variety of different jobs throughout his life. He worked as a gravedigger for quite a period of time, and it was reported that he stole things from the corpses that he was burying. Now that suggests to me that he wasn't horrified or repulsed by dead bodies, and that's something that would be quite influential later on.
On Valentine's Day 1967, 21-year-old Sutcliffe met Sonia Shermer. The pair began a long-term relationship, eventually getting married in August 1974.
The relationship that he had with his wife, Sonia, appeared to have been a decent one, and I think he would have treated her fairly well because she served a purpose for him. Women like his mother and his wife, he saw as carers and nurturers, people who would look after him. Other women, I think he saw somewhat differently. I think Peter Sutcliffe's view of women is very black and white. They are either Madonnas or they are whores. So they're either these perfect domestic angels or they're these sinful creatures.
These opposing views on women collided with one another when a family revelation dramatically altered 23-year-old Sutcliffe's world. His mother, whom he'd looked up to as a child, had been unfaithful.
His mother had had an affair with a policeman, and his father had decided to confront his wife at a hotel where she was meeting this particular man, and took Peter with him.
Peter's father basically humiliated her and said, look, I know all about what's going on, and the children found out as well. So I think this kind of further cemented ideas as to what women were, what could be expected of them, always to be cautious and wary of them.
I think there was every possibility that after seeing his mother and seeing what happened, that possibly preyed on his mind and affected his attitude towards women.
Sutcliffe began to visit the red light districts of Yorkshire and find solace in prostitutes. But his feelings for these women would soon lead to violence and eventually murder. On the morning of October the 30th, 1975, just 12 miles away in the Chapeltown area of Leeds, the body of 28-year-old Wilma McCann was discovered in a local park.
Wilma McCann was a Scottish woman who had come down to Yorkshire. She was working as a prostitute. She was very hard up, and it was very difficult for her because she had young children, young family to support. And I think that was the only way she felt she could get enough money.
The attack on Wilma McCann set in motion what would become a clear pattern and regular method of ambush by the killer.
His modus operandi was to use a ball-peen hammer and was to strike them very hard and very fast on the back of the head so they fell unconscious. He used his hammer and hit her over the back of the head, and then he stabbed her 15 times in the neck, chest and abdomen.
But the police were no closer to catching the killer, and 3 months later, on the 20th of January 1976, another woman was murdered in Leeds. 42-year-old wife and mother Emily Jackson, who'd vanished after a night out at her local pub. Emily's son Neil was 17 years old at the time. He remembers receiving the tragic news on that fateful morning.
I've come downstairs. My dad's loading one of the vans up for work, and I'm getting my boots on ready for going to work and having a pot of tea, when they were knocking at the door and it opened the place. And that's when I first knew. And it was first knew when, like I said, for Dad, when the police knocked at the door. I can still remember it plain as day.
Again, a hammer had been used in the brutal attack. Emily had also been stabbed a total of 52 times with a screwdriver. Like Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson had been working as a prostitute to make ends meet.
It was just to help the family in dire straits, is what I've been told afterwards. When family were in hard times work-wise, she went elsewhere, but I didn't realise till well after.
This time, police were able to recover from the scene a key piece of evidence. On Emily's right thigh was a very firm and visible footprint from a size 7 Wellington boot.
For some inexplicable reason, he stamped on her thigh with such force that it left an imprint of the sole of his boot on her thigh. Now, police tried to trace that boot, or the manufacturers of the boot, which they did, and then try and find out people who had bought them, but it didn't come to anything.
Once again, the trail went cold. It was over a year until a murder with a familiar MO took place in Leeds. On the morning of February the 5th, 1977, the body of 28-year-old Irene Richardson was discovered. She'd been savagely murdered, another prostitute killed with a hammer. West Yorkshire police were suddenly dealing with a serial killer. What they didn't realise is that this was just the beginning of what would become one of the most infamous series of murders in British history. Less than 3 months after the death of a third victim, Irene Richardson, the killer struck again. On the night of the 23rd of April 1977, 32-year-old prostitute Patricia Atkinson became victim number 4. She was murdered in her own flat, this time not in Leeds, but in nearby Bradford.
She believed that if she invited customers into her flat, she was safe because all the killings had taken place in isolated parks or back alleys. So she thought she was safe, but she wasn't.
The killer hit Patricia 4 times around the head with a hammer and then mutilated her body with a knife. This time, detectives found a clue to link the murders of Patricia Atkinson and Emily Jackson.
The police found the same boot mark on the bedclothes at Patricia's house, Patricia's flat, as they found on Emily Jackson's thigh.
This crucial link confirmed the authorities' worst fears. The killer was expanding his hunting ground, and he seemed to have a favoured target. All 4 murder victims had been working as prostitutes. On the 17th of November 1980 in Leeds, Jacqueline Hill, a 20-year-old student, was hit over the head, stabbed repeatedly and mutilated. An attack that bore all the hallmarks of the Ripper. But Jacqueline Hill would be Peter Sutcliffe's final victim. Within 2 months, a routine police stop would lead to one of the most sensational arrests of modern times. The capture of the Yorkshire Ripper.
Just after New Year, on January 2nd, 1981, Peter went to Sheffield and picked up a prostitute. On the same evening, a policeman with a lot of years of service, decided to show a young rookie round Sheffield.
The two police officers spotted Sutcliffe's car near offices on Melbourne Avenue in Sheffield's red light district. They decided to approach and talk to the pair.
The cops asked, what's your girlfriend's name? He said, I don't know, we've only just met. And the policeman said, you know, I haven't just fallen off a Christmas tree. So he already realised there was something odd going on.
Peter said that he needed to urinate, and the officers let him go up to a wall by the side of the building. While he was away, the young police officer did a PNC check on the registration of the car and found that the plates were false. So Peter was arrested and taken to Dewsbury police station.
Once down at the station, Sutcliffe was searched. He wasn't carrying any weapons, but this time detectives weren't going to let him slip from their grasp.
So one of them thought, let's go back to that place where we spotted him and let's see if he did leave anything when he popped out of the car saying he was going to have a pee.
The police returned to the scene of the original arrest.
They found the hammer, the intended murder weapon, and they came back with them. And gradually after that, Peter Sutcliffe realised that the game was up, and eventually he confessed. And his only condition was that he be allowed to tell his wife, Sonia, before it became known to the general public that he was indeed the Yorkshire Ripper.
It had been over 5 years since the murder of Wilma McCann, but detectives finally had the Ripper in custody. It was a crime that horrified the nation. In the summer of 2012, 12-year-old schoolgirl Tia Sharp disappeared from her grandmother's house in South London, prompting one of the most publicised search campaigns in British history. But on the 10th of August, it came to an abrupt end, with a twist so horrific it seemed impossible to comprehend. Tia's body and her killer had been right in front of the cameras the entire time.
The sense of loss here is mixed with all sorts of emotions. People feel cheated. Their week-long campaign was a desperate mission to find Tia Sharp. It ended with the 12-year-old found dead in her own grandmother's home.
The killer was 37-year-old Stuart Hazell, a man that Tia looked up to and affectionately called Grandad. Detective Nick Scholar remembers encountering him during the search for Tia.
Throughout all of my meetings with him, his demeanour never really changed. He was always a very quiet person. He didn't come across as being particularly intelligent or articulate, and he answered questions very simply.
But behind Hazell's quiet nature was a ruthless, callous killer.
Stuart Hazell committed the most horrible of murders, yet was able to lie to his family, lie to his friends. To do that, he must have been a particularly calculating and vile man.
His story begins over 40 years ago. Born on the 26th of May 1975 in Kingston upon Thames, Surrey, Stuart Hazell was introduced to a life of dysfunction from an early age.
His father was in and out of prison, so there wasn't a lot of stability. It was quite disorganised, it was quite chaotic. He spent quite a lot of time in the residential care system, he was moved around quite a lot, and I think that did have quite a significant impact on his personality because he didn't really form attachments with other people. So that kind of absence of warmth, that absence of closeness in those early years is something that really does shape him.
By the time Hazell reached his teens, he'd already begun a life of petty crime.
Stuart Hazell started drinking when he was about 13, and that got him into quite a lot of trouble. So he ended up with his first conviction when he was 14 years old.
It was a pattern that continued into adulthood. Between 2001 and 2010, Hazell was in and out of prison for offences ranging from racially aggravated behaviour to drug dealing. In 2003, 28-year-old Hazell began dating Natalie Sharp, a single mother with a 3-year-old daughter called Tia. But the relationship was in no way conventional. After they split up, he began seeing Natalie's mother, Christine Bicknell.
Well, I think Stuart Hazell is somebody who is quite predatory, who identifies people that he can get things from, essentially. And he had a relationship with Tia's mother that lasted all of about 2.5 weeks. And very soon after that, he started a relationship with Tia's grandmother, which was much more longer lasting.
Although 10 years her junior, Hazell moved into Christine's home on the Lindens estate in New Addington, South London in 2007. He soon settled in and enjoyed spending time with Christine's now 7-year-old granddaughter Tia. But he struggled to find work.
Well, Stuart Hazell didn't really have a regular form of employment. He was in and out of prison so much, and it's very difficult to maintain regular, well-paid, steady employment when you have a lengthy prison record. So he would go from job to job, doing work cash in hand, and all of that type of thing.
I said, right, whatever happens, we run throughout. So even if we break, we keep the recording going, so the mic's on constantly. And I said, just go with it. Whatever happens, go with it. So we got in, we set up, and Stuart was really anxious. He was very anxious. And what I needed from him was a really detailed account in real micro detail about what happened from the point that Tia came to the home to the point that she was last seen by him. So minute by minute, as much as he could, breaking that down, and that's what I did. And I got him to talk in real detail, because I knew that every single piece that I'd interview would be poured over by the police. Because by the Thursday morning, after the phone call that I'd had saying Stuart would give an interview, I knew this was an interview with a killer. No doubt about it at all.
Well, if they believe what they read in the papers, they can do whatever they like, because I know deep down in my heart that Tia walked out of my house. She walked out of there, and I know damn well because she was seen walking down the pathway.
Body language expert Robert Phipps was certain Hazell was lying.
I loved her to bits. She's like my own daughter.
Stuart's behaviour throughout this interview is inconsistent with somebody who is in turmoil, worried, anxious about Tia Sharp being missing. His body language is far too animated. He's shrugging his shoulders a lot. People shrug their shoulders when they're saying, I don't know. But he's giving supposedly truthful statements and saying, I don't know.
I know she made that track down to that way.
And I think he was struggling at times, sometimes, to be able to remember what he necessarily said to everybody else. And of course, the more detail I asked of him, the more difficult it became for him to remember exactly what he'd said. Because what he couldn't do, of course, was give me something that he'd given to somebody else differently.
Did you do anything? I said, well, no, I bloody didn't.
Stuart adds in a lot of detail, which is superfluous to his actual answer.
From the co-op, we just got on the T31, because you come out the co-op and take a right, cut down this little pathway and a bus stop, T31 bus.
This is to pad out the story because it's not the truth. So he's adding in other bits that make it sound truthful. Now, when you talk to most people who recall a story, they don't tell it in a logical, orderly sequence. They start saying something and then they remember something else, and the conversation actually, or the statements that they're making, chop and change.
Crossed over by the zebra crossing and come home.
During normal conversation, people blink around about 20 blinks per minute. If you look at Stuart's behaviour, his blinking rate is around about 40 to 45 blinks. This is very high and would indicate that he's actually nervous about what's going on during the interview.
He seemed to me somebody who was insincere. His breaking down, his almost tearful performance smacked to me of somebody who was trying to put on a performance. The fact that he was sitting there with the T-shirt, find Tia, I think there was a picture of her in the background, all suggested to me that this was a man trying too hard to appeal for information when he knew exactly what had happened to her.
She walked past me from the front room to go out. And she walked out the front door, that is all I know.
What he's doing is he's looking away from the interviewer and down and to his right. This normally indicates that he's using the left-hand side of his brain. This is where you go to construct pictures. If it's a memory that you have in your head, you would generally look up and to the left, which means you're using the right-hand side of your brain, which is generally where most people hold their visual memory.
It's bad. It is bad. No one knows. We're getting false hope. We're getting people seeing sightings. Yeah, it's good to get sightings, but we want a 100% definite sighting. Do you know what I mean? It's crazy.
The week-long search for missing 12-year-old schoolgirl Tia Sharp had come to a tragic end. Police had found her body in the loft of her grandmother's house. On Saturday, the 11th of August 2012, Stuart Hazell, Tia's grandmother's partner, was being questioned on suspicion of her murder.
What can you tell me about the murder of Tia Sharp, Stuart?
Oh, a couple of minutes with my solicitor, please.
Okay.
On the same day, a post-mortem was being carried out at Croydon Mortuary.
Clearly, Tia had been dead for a week, and unfortunately, the body had begun to decompose quite badly.
The thing with decomposition is that the rate can be very variable. It depends on all sorts of factors. If you've got somebody who's wrapped up to prevent the smell getting out, they're potentially in somewhere that's not particularly warm, which will retard decomposition. In this particular case, the passage of time and the changes that had occurred to the body in the post-mortem period really limited what pathology could tell you.
The police still had no evidence that Hazell had killed Tia, but a further search of the loft had uncovered her clothes, glasses, and, hidden elsewhere in the house, something truly sinister.
On this occasion, found pushed behind the door frame on the inside of a cupboard door, above head height, was a memory card for a digital camera. We recovered deleted images from that card that were quite disturbing. There was some where clearly he had searched the internet and found pictures of girls that were not dissimilar looking to Tia, in that they had glasses and a similar hairstyle. But worst of all, on that memory card was perhaps the most grotesque image I've ever seen. So we took the photograph to show a pathologist, and he pointed out the hypostasis on it, which is essentially how the blood pools on a dead body. And this pathologist was of the opinion that that was a picture of a dead girl.
Also recorded on the memory card were a number of videos.
One was of Tia sitting on a settee, looked like she's rubbing suntan lotion or some kind of cream into her legs. Clearly, he had given the impression perhaps he was sending a text or something, but all the time he was secretly filming Tia.
One of the clips undeniably linked the camera to Hazell.
Another video image was particularly unnerving. It showed Hazell filming Tia when she was asleep. He'd obviously gone into her room and was walking around her with the phone in his hand. He also just briefly filmed his own shadow on the wall, menacingly standing over her.
On Saturday, August the 11th, 2012, Stuart Hazell was charged with the murder of Tia Sharp.
So Jeffrey Dahmer really did ramp up his offending. The scale and the nature of his behaviour became all the more grotesque. So he wasn't just killing people, dismembering them, and then disposing of their bodies. He started to do some really bizarre things.
He was in the process of constructing some hideously diabolical shrine in his bedroom out of the skulls and skeletons of some of his victims. It's almost as though some bizarre, archaic thing had broken through and he was performing or creating some sort of ancient, human sacrificial temple in this little Milwaukee apartment.
In 1990, Dahmer killed another 4 young men. His MO was becoming more and more polished.
He would offer his victims money to go back to his apartment with him to take pictures, nude photographs of them, and then perhaps to have sex. Every single one of his victims went with him willingly. He would offer them a drink, and once he found out what they wanted to drink, he kept a lot of things on hand, different kinds of alcohol, and that's when he would put a drug in it that would put them to sleep, or that would relax them so that they would pass out.
They would pass out. He would then have sex with them while they were passed out, do with them as he wished, but of course they couldn't do to him. Then as they approached recovery, coming out of it, he would strangle them to death.
It seemed as though Dahmer got a thrill, not from the murder, but from the dead bodies of his victims.
Dahmer liked necrophilia. He liked sex with unconscious people. He wasn't a slasher in the sense that he took delight in killing. His purpose was sex with these people, company with these people. That's hard to believe.
He would commit necrophiliac sex acts on the corpses, dismember the corpses, dissolve parts of the bodies in these vats of acid he had, keep certain organs in his refrigerator, some of which he would actually cannibalize.
Dahmer said that the cannibalism that he engaged in was born out of a curiosity. He wanted to find out, first of all, what that would be like. He also said that there was an element of wanting to make these people a part of him, so they would be with him forever.
Dahmer, from the beginning, was driven by this terror of being alone. He said he killed his first victim, Stephen Hicks, when Hicks said he had to go, and Dahmer didn't want to be alone. There's some desire, which is part of normal sexuality. You love somebody, somebody will say, oh, I love you so much, I want to eat you up. With normal people, that's obviously metaphorical, but it does express some desire to be so close to the person that you want to incorporate them into, you want to merge with them. With somebody like Dahmer, that becomes this very literal horror.
And the horror only became worse when Dahmer began experimenting with his semi-conscious victims.
He would drill holes in their skulls and put muriatic acid inside to see if he could get them to a zombie state so that he could keep them alive and subservient to him.
It's essentially an amateur version of attempting to perform a lobectomy or a lobotomy, but it would be an incredibly unpleasant and damaging thing to do to someone's brain. If you affect the frontal lobes, you will affect personality, potentially make somebody docile. If he's less accurate, you could essentially cause a stroke that could cause paralysis, speech problems. It really very much depends on which part of the brain is actually damaged.
But, of course, that didn't work, and his victims died one after another. Hearing about that is the stuff of horror movies. And the fact that it was happening in a city where we were known for manufacturing and beer and a very good Midwestern work ethic, tight families, this isn't the kind of thing that happens here.
In May 1991, 31-year-old Jeffrey Dahmer was in his killing prime. He'd already murdered 11 men and had begun collecting bones and skulls from his victims and cannibalizing their organs. What would have been a nightmare for most was a fantasy for him, and he carefully went about his killings under the radar of the police and the people of Milwaukee.
Jeffrey Dahmer had a job in a local chocolate factory, and I think for him it enabled him to maintain a facade of normality. He was just an average Joe, a regular guy who went to work every day.
I think he killed so many people without being caught because of the fact that he looked like everyone else. He did what successful serial killers do. He blended. They blend in with society. Now, he was a Caucasian male living in a predominantly African-American neighborhood, but he didn't talk to anybody. He didn't bother anybody. He was barely someone people noticed. Barely noticed. He also was targeting people who, he found out, might not be missed.
For most people, if they were to commit the type of acts that Jeffrey Dahmer did, they would no way be able to function normally. But Jeffrey Dahmer was not most people. He hasn't got the same level of repulsion and shock at dead bodies or mutilated bodies that most of us have. It was just another aspect of his life.
It was not known that we had a serial slayer loose in our city. We did not know because he was so cleverly disposing of the bodies. The families were reporting the sons were missing, but the police were not finding bodies. And not infrequently, young men, something happens in their life, they just up and leave town. That happens enough that the police don't get worried. If it's a woman, they'll immediately commit resources to investigate, but young men, they don't.
But on May the 26th, 1991, Dahmer came agonizingly close to capture after an encounter with a 14-year-old boy.
Dahmer had taken Conrad Synthesymphone, a young Asian male who he found attractive. He met him in the mall, offered him money to go back to his apartment. He went, and he began to work the ritual. Dahmer would drug him, and then he began the process of this crude lobotomy, and he had drilled a hole in this young man's head. He took a break. He ran out to get more beer. While he was gone, Konarak ran out of the apartment. He was naked, he was completely dazed, and he was running up the alley next to Dahmer's apartment building. A woman in another apartment building saw him running up the alley and said, "There's a boy running up the alley, something's going on," and then these women called the police.
And then Dahmer appeared, and again, this is another remarkable characteristic of these psychopaths, is that they have an ability to maintain, a kind of coolness under the most extraordinarily high-pressured circumstances.
So he walked up to the officers, "Good evening, officers." He's very polite, he's sober, and he said, "This is my boyfriend. He came to stay with me. We had a little bit too much to drink, and he ran out of the house." He said, "How old is he?" Dahmer said, "He's 19. And the officers said, "Okay, well, just to make sure, let's all walk back up to the apartment together."
The cops went in and looked around. They even peeked into the bedroom where there was a decomposing corpse of one of Dahmer's previous victims, but, they took such a cursory look at it that they didn't even notice it.
Assuming the couple were having a lover's tiff, the two police officers left Konarak alone with Dahmer in the apartment building. And in the early hours of the morning, he murdered the 14-year-old boy. An opportunity to catch the killer had been missed.
I think that really speaks volumes about the attitudes of the police at the time in terms of ethnic minorities, in terms of young people, in terms of the gay community, and that was another victim that could potentially have been saved. So there's this terrible thing going on behind closed doors and people just aren't seeing it. People aren't wanting to see it. Even the police are not joining up the dots and finding out what's really going on. So this is allowed to just bubble away and get worse.
After evading capture, Dahmer was free to continue.
There was two sides, really, to Dahmer's pleasure that he got from killing his victims. So he was a sadist who enjoys the pain and suffering of other people. And with sadists, that thrill ends when the victim dies. But Dahmer was also something of a necrophiliac who was interested in having corpses around and doing things with those corpses. And that means that the thrill starts with death. So he has this continuous fulfillment going on. And he's always fully in control. And I think that's what's really at the root of Jeffrey Dahmer. It's power and it's control, and it's the feeling that he has all this knowledge about what he's done and nobody else quite knows what he's up to.
By July 1991, Dahmer's desire to kill had become insatiable. In just 16 days, he murdered 4 more men, bringing his total number of victims to 17. But Dahmer's reign of terror was about to come to an end. On July the 22nd, he met a man called Tracy Edwards.
While they were together in the apartment, Dahmer threw a handcuff on him. This was now the beginning of his ritual. Dahmer had taken photographs of his victims in various stages of dismemberment, Polaroids. And those were sitting on the dresser inside the bedroom. They weren't sitting out in the main living room, but there was some speculation that Tracy Edwards had perhaps seen that. And he ran out of the apartment in his underwear, ran down the street, and when he saw the police car, Tracy Edwards has said his intention was just to get the handcuff off. That's all he wanted. He stopped these cops to say, hey, can you just get this off of me? So he stopped, and the officers start talking to him about what he saw, and then they said, well, we should probably check this out. Let's all go back to the apartment. Dahmer answered, and the minute he saw that it was the police, he tried to shut the door on them. The police pushed the door open a bit. They started struggling with him, and then finally, he just gave in. And that was when Dahmer was officially finished. He was finished killing, and he knew that he was finished.
Raoul Moat was born on the 17th of June in Gateshead in the northeast of England.
He was raised largely by his grandmother. His mother had some mental health issues, but she lived in the local area, so he did have some contact with her. But it wasn't anything really out of the ordinary. A lot of families have to cope with that kind of thing.
During the 1970s and 80s, the northeast of England was an area in economic decline. Its traditional heavy industries such as shipbuilding and mining were phased out, and many men lost their jobs.
It wasn't a particularly economically prosperous area, so it was always going to be a challenge for Moat to find his way in the world as a man. Many teenagers go through a lot of changes, particularly at momentous points in their teenage years. When Moat was 16, he left school, and there were some changes in him around about that time. So he became quite fixated on bodybuilding. And this is something that you often find with young working class lads in an area where the prospects of those traditional kind of tough men's jobs are few and far between. They look to other ways to become men, to make themselves visibly masculine. And I think that was what Moat was doing.
When you see the results, then in anything, you get more, oh wow, this is working. So then he went in more and more, and then he started getting to steroids.
It was clear that Moat had had some serious psychiatric problems growing up, and he'd obviously decided to express himself as the big fella around town. He was 6'3", 17 stone, and liked this idea of being a large, well-built, muscle bodybuilder, and he clearly used a lot of steroids. And people who were close to him talked time and time again about just what a terrible temper he'd got.
Moat was somebody who has what I would describe as poor behavioural control. So somebody who flies off the handle quite easily, somebody who's quite readily aggravated. And if you throw steroids into the mix, you get what people often refer to as roid rage, a real inability to control your temper. And it increases the levels of testosterone in the body. So when somebody has a predilection towards aggression, and then you add that on top of it, you've got a really toxic mix.
Moat had found work as a tree surgeon, and his physical appearance came in handy in his other role as a nightclub doorman. By 2005, the 32-year-old was caught by the police carrying a knuckle duster and a samurai sword. He'd fallen foul of the law on numerous occasions.
He was known to the police for incidents of domestic abuse. He had a number of partners with which he had troubled relationships with, and the police were involved. He had arrests for, generally speaking, low-level violence.
By 2010, 37-year-old Moat had fathered several children with different partners. His latest girlfriend, Samantha, was 15 years his junior. They'd been in an on and off relationship for 6 years and had a daughter together.
Well, the relationship between Samantha and Moat was an incredibly controlling one. It's one that I classify as coercively controlling. So Moat believed that Samantha was his possession. He was in control, he decided what happened, and she basically had to suck it up and get on with it. So it was his rules. Everything was focused around him.
And he would control everything. He would control her movements, what she could buy, could not buy, what she did, who she talked to on the phone. So obviously Samantha would probably feel like completely controlled. She didn't have the right to do anything.
You often find in relationships like this, women are kind of treading on eggshells, trying not to upset their abusive partner. But at the same time, it's very, very difficult for them to leave. Often looking from the outside, we say, well, why are you staying in this relationship? And often it's to keep themselves safe because they know that if they were to leave, they'd put themselves in quite a significant amount of danger.
Samantha was desperate to leave Raoul Moat, and in the spring of 2010, a chance presented itself. Moat was convicted of assaulting a family member and sentenced to 18 weeks in Durham prison. Moat's anger was uncontrollable. He decided he was going to kill Christopher Brown as soon as he got out of jail. He enlisted the help of a friend, Carl Ness.
Moat started planning this while he was in prison. He recruited or he used Carl Ness to keep an eye on Samantha and do what we would call surveillance by watching her house, seeing who comes and goes, identifying vehicles, and try and identify who the new boyfriend was.
On Thursday, the 1st of July 2010, 37-year-old Raoul Moat was released from prison. He didn't waste any time. It's alleged that Carl Ness had found a shotgun for him to use.
The way in which Moat planned this was quite meticulous. He took steps to try and identify the karate instructor, i.e. Christopher, by making phone calls to health centres, to karate clubs, to the extent that he actually drove around the routes that they took on the fatal night. They actually had a dry run, if you like, on the Thursday night.
On Friday, the 2nd of July, staff at Durham Prison warned Northumbria police that Moat might pose a risk to Samantha. But, unfortunately, the information wasn't acted upon. The same day, Moat was captured on CCTV in Newcastle, sporting a Mohican hairstyle. Later that night, Carl Ness drove Moat to nearby Gateshead, where Samantha and Christopher were at a house party.
Moat was dropped off quite near the address that Samantha and Christopher were visiting, and he was able to walk in there and hide himself underneath the front window next to the front door, where he was able to listen because it was a July night, the window was open, it was warm.
He could hear people talking and saying things, and he picked up on things that were being said about him or things that he perceived to be about him. And he started texting his friend Ness and expressing his anger and frustration at what he was hearing. This is going on, it's really annoying me. He's essentially venting. And this is something that you see narcissistic people do quite a lot. They want an audience for their complaints and their rants. They want validation. They want other people to agree with them and say, yeah, you're completely reasonable.
Moat lay in wait outside the house.
Around about 2:30 in the morning, Samantha and Christopher leave, and as they come out the front door, Moat stood up. He was clearly armed with a gun, and pretty much without warning, he immediately shot Christopher. Christopher started trying to run away, and as he tried to run across the grass area, he was shot again, which was enough to make him fall. Moat then calmly walked over, reloaded his gun in front of witnesses, and then shot him a third time, causing his death. It was nothing more than a cold and calculated assassination.
It was a public execution. Moat had used a sawn-off shotgun to shoot Christopher Brown at point-blank range. On the evening of Friday, the 9th of July, the nation was glued to their television sets as the drama unfolded. But this wasn't a film, it was real life. The police were dealing with a man who was erratic, armed, and extremely dangerous.
We had police negotiators who were there on the scene, face to face, who spent the next 6 hours or so speaking to him and trying to persuade him that the right thing to do was put the gun down and surrender himself to custody.
The police were determined to make sure that Moat came out of the standoff alive. the presence of the media added extra pressure on their performance.
You're there focused on doing your job, but you're doing your job in the knowledge that there's lots of people watching you, scrutinising you, and some of them judging you.
But Moat wasn't planning on giving himself up so easily, and the case continued to attract media attention.
Extraordinary part of this story was the involvement of celebrities. Almost as the manhunt came to its dramatic and fatal climax, we got the almost bizarre scene of Gaza, Paul Gascoigne, famous England footballer, turning up in his dressing gown, claiming to know Raoul Moat and offering Moat chicken and lager if he gave himself up. Didn't come to anything. The police just asked Gaza to politely leave the town and had nothing more to do with it.
As the night of Friday, the 9th of July, turned into the early hours of Saturday, the situation remained tense. Negotiations with Moat weren't working, and he remained where he was, with a gun pointed at his own head.
It was an incredibly long and tense night. Darkness fell. We really could see very little of what was going on. We could just see the outlines of the police cordon, and the night dragged on after midnight into the small hours, and it was around 1 o'clock in the morning when there was a dramatic series of events. Hard to make out. It was confused, it was dark, it was very difficult to know exactly what the sequence of events were.
In one last attempt to capture Moat, the police decided to use a taser on the 37-year-old. They were determined to take him alive.
On this occasion, the tasers that were used were long tasers, like shotgun-style tasers, which hadn't yet been approved for use by the police. When you're in a mindset and a determination to arrest somebody, to call them to account for the crimes that they've committed in the safest possible way, then it was right and proper that it was given a try. It didn't work.
At approximately 1:15 a.m. on Sunday the 10th of July, the sound of a shotgun blast, followed by shouting, signalled that Raoul Moat had taken his own life.
Sinclair was born in Glasgow in the post-war years, and this was a time of real change and real upheaval for the city. There was a lot of poverty and there was quite a significant gang culture, so violence was part and parcel of everyday life for many young men.
Angus had two older siblings, a brother and a sister, but this didn't stop him from being picked on.
He was the runt of the litter, but he was also small. By the time he'd reached puberty, he was constantly being bullied, knocked about, thrown about.
Tragically, Sinclair's father died when he was just 4 years old.
I think that certainly increased his feeling of depression, of being an outsider, of not being like everybody else, and he chose to identify with petty theft and petty crime as his revolt against the world.
In 1959, when Sinclair was just a young teen, he committed his first offence.
He was only 13 when he stole the offertory box at the local church, and that led to him having a criminal conviction.
At the same time, he became preoccupied with sex.
Now, the early sexualisation of young men is a clue to problems later on. And we start to see this pattern in Angus Sinclair.
By the age of 15, Sinclair's bad behaviour escalated and became increasingly violent. He viciously attacked an 8-year-old girl.
If there was a trigger to the career that he then went on to found as a rapist and a murderer, 1961 was probably the moment in which it started, because later in the year, he committed the first serious attack on a neighbour, young girl, lived nearby.
On July the 1st, Sinclair was home alone when he decided to strike again. This time, the victim was a child who lived in a neighbouring flat in the tenement block, 7-year-old Catherine.
He's 16 at the time, and there's quite a lot of respect amongst children for older children. So he asks her to run an errand for him, and she goes out and she does it. Now, when she comes back, he attacks her.
Sinclair took the girl up to his flat, where he viciously assaulted her. Then, in the middle of his heinous act, he suddenly stopped.
There's a knock at the door, and he just literally stops what he's doing and goes and answers the door and sends the neighbour away.
Sinclair got rid of the visitor and went back to attacking the girl. He raped her. He killed her using a ligature from a bicycle in a bicycle tube. It's a vicious, premeditated, calculating, callous attack on an utterly innocent young girl.
The callous killer quickly came up with a plan to dispose of the child's body.
I think most 16-year-olds would panic, but what he did was he sorted out her lower clothing to try to hide the fact that it had been a sexual attack. He rolled her body down the stairs and he left it there to be found, obviously hoping that it would look as though she had fallen downstairs and injured herself.
Left at the bottom of the communal staircase inside the tenement block, Catherine was quickly found by neighbours. By the following day, she was confirmed dead. Forensic testing was still in its infancy at the time, but with such key evidence, scientists hoped their analysis could help pinpoint the killer.
Now, blood grouping on these materials should be fairly straightforward when it's that fresh, but it actually proved quite difficult to get good, clear results on, so we had to kind of abandon those results. We weren't able to get terribly clear results on that.
Scientists at the time could not help the police find the culprits, now branded the World's End killers by the press. Lester Knibb and the team at the lab held on to the samples in the hope that future advancements in forensic technology would later solve the case.
Relatively early in 1978, that the police kind of drew a close. We produced a report, an interim report, to keep the police up to date with what we'd found. And effectively all the exhibits were taken away for storage by the police.
But just over a year after the World's End murders, Sinclair struck again. On November the 19th, 1978, he was prowling near Barnhill Station in the suburbs of Glasgow. There he spotted a target, a petite 17-year-old machinist called Mary Gallagher.
Mary Gallagher was in her late teens, but the significant thing about Mary is that she was tiny. She looked like a child.
Mary Gallagher was going to meet her friend over the other side of the railway tracks, and her mother saw her set out, her sister saw her set out as well.
Mary was last seen leaving her home at 6:45 p.m.
Sinclair threatened Mary with a knife. He demanded that she took her clothes off, and he slit her throat with a knife. This was a really, really nasty attack.
It would take more than 20 years to prove that Sinclair was Mary's killer. Meanwhile, he continued to commit a catalogue of cruel offences.
One of the extraordinary things about Sinclair was known to the police. He had a reputation as a mugger. At one point, he got a handgun conviction. They knew he was a violent man, but they didn't connect the dots. Sinclair was a man who got away with it for a very long time.
Between 1978 and 1982, a total of 11 children reported being sexually assaulted by Sinclair.
Over a number of years, we think exclusively targeted children because there aren't any unsolved rapes or rapes and murders of that time from about 1978 to 1982 that match his MO.
Sinclair would ask them to run an errand for him, and then when they returned, he would attack them.
Sinclair used his job as a painter and decorator as cover for his despicable deeds. In 1982, Sinclair was finally caught out. In June, Sinclair was in the Woodlands area of Glasgow, where he assaulted a 6-year-old girl. But this time, the alert child was able to identify her attacker.
One girl, 6-year-old girl, who he carried out a really serious sexual assault on, recognised the smell of turpentine on him. He was dressed as a painter and flecks of paint were on his hair and shoes.
Sinclair, now aged 37, was arrested and subsequently stood trial at Edinburgh's High Court. On August the 31st, 1982, he was convicted of 3 charges of rape, 7 charges of lewd and libidinous practices, and a breach of the peace.
The Crown decided to take a very, very simple approach to the case. They decided not to bother with all the supporting evidence, the hairs and fibres, the knots, nothing like that. They decided just to go on the simple, straightforward DNA. Here is a girl that's been murdered. Here is her coat. On that coat is DNA, and the DNA belongs to Angus Sinclair. End of story.
Sinclair and his lawyers saw a chance to deny the murder.
Eventually, in 2004, the DNA evidence points conclusively to Sinclair as part of the World's End killings. Sinclair stands trial, but comes up with what to him, I'm sure, seemed a perfect defence. Oh, yes, this DNA proves I had sex with Christine and Helen after the World's End. But of course it was entirely consensual, and when I left them with my brother-in-law Gordon, they were alive and well, and as far as I was aware, in fine spirits. It was all Gordon's fault. That was his defence.
Sinclair's testimony was enough to prove reasonable doubt.
The judge decided that because of the suggestion of consensual sex, then that the whole of the DNA evidence which was being put forward by the Crown was no longer relevant. None of the supporting evidence had been included by the Crown, and therefore the case fell in 2007.
Without any other forensic evidence, Judge Lord Clark threw the case out.
It was one of the worst days of my life. I mean, I can remember it distinctly yet. It was just this sense of total disbelief.
The families of Helen and Christine had been waiting 30 years for justice. Helen Scott's father was there that day.
Absolutely shattered. Words can't explain how I feel. 30 years of trying to get a conclusion.
The decision also sent shockwaves across Scotland.
When the trial collapsed, a lot of journalists, politicians, and significantly the Lord Advocate themselves, who's in charge of all prosecutions in Scotland, said, "Whoa, stop. Something about this isn't right." And that started a pretty root and branch review of the justice system, particularly when it comes to double jeopardy.
Scotland was one of the last countries in Western Europe to have a law that stated you could not be tried for the same crime twice. It was overhauled in the wake of the 2007 trial.
So the law changed, and then Angus Sinclair was the first person to be retried under the double jeopardy legislation.
When the go-ahead for the second trial was given, I came out of the court and I phoned my dad straight away to tell him. It wasn't about celebrating. None of this has ever been about celebrating, but what it did do was just give that opportunity to bring this chapter to an end.
On the 13th of October 2014, 69-year-old Angus Sinclair stood trial again for the murders of 2 17-year-old friends, Helen Scott and Christine Eadie. This time, the Crown prosecutors used all the latest forensic technology to make their case.
The trial lasted weeks. I attended every day, and this time the Crown got it absolutely right. I mean, there was compelling evidence from knots to soil samples to DNA, to just a whole picture was put together. Exactly what should have happened in 2007 and didn't. And the jury convicted him unanimously. There was no question whatsoever.
Levi Bellfield was born into a Romany gypsy family in Isleworth, West London on the 17th of May 1968. He was one of 5 children. Aged 10, Bellfield lost his father to leukemia, and as a result, he formed a very close bond with his mother.
Bellfield was very much a mother's boy, much beloved of his mother. It was a close-knit family, brought up in West London, in what was effectively once a huge community of travellers, and was groomed to thinking from the very early days that he was very special, that there was something particular about him. His mother encouraged him in that view.
I think during his childhood he was a bit of a tearaway. He was a young lad who wanted to do what he wanted to do and not much stood in his way. So he was often kind of larking around and getting into a bit of trouble at school, but nothing completely out of the ordinary.
By the time Bellfield was 13, he'd had his first brush with the law and was arrested for burglary in 1981. It would not be the last time he was in trouble with the police.
I believe Bellfield occupied what you might describe as the halo of Levi Bellfield. I am greater than anything. He was above the law, above suspicion, operated entirely under his own steam, in his own way, at his own time.
In 1989, 21-year-old Bellfield set up home with a girlfriend. They went on to have 4 children together.
He could literally charm the birds off the trees. This is a 19.5, 20-stone man with a huge neck, almost occupying his entire shoulders. He wasn't an attractive man, but my goodness me, he had the gift of the gab, and he didn't half use it to his advantage, particularly when it came to girls.
On March the 21st, 2002, 13-year-old schoolgirl Amanda Dowler, known affectionately as Millie, went missing from her home. Journalist Martin Brunt remembers that day very well.
She was on her way home. She got off the train, was going to walk the half-mile or so back to her home. She was in her school uniform, very identifiable. This was daylight, busy time of the afternoon, lots of people around, but nobody saw anything.
Millie had phoned her father to say she was heading home, but never arrived.
She seemed to have disappeared into thin air. There was CCTV footage of her getting off the train at Walton Station. Some very blurred images of cars and the odd person in the street where she was headed home, but nothing more than that. And it became clear very early on that police were really struggling to find what had happened to her.
The last sighting of Millie Dowler was on Station Avenue in Walton, just 50 yards from the home of Levi Bellfield.
The search has taken in stretches of water, including the River Mole, but police have been concentrating on ground near the busy station and interviewing commuters.
We have nothing that gives us any positive indication that she's gone off of her own volition. Equally, we have no positive information that she has been taken off the street and abducted. At this time, all of our lines of inquiry are open.
On September the 18th, 2002, 6 months after her disappearance, the body of Millie Dowler was found by a group of foragers amongst the trees of Yateley Heath Wood in Hampshire.
So Millie was identified through dental records. She was known to be missing. Dental records were obtained, and then they were compared to the remains that were present, and sadly for her family, it confirmed that that's who it was.
It was clear to forensic ecologist Professor Patricia Wiltshire that Millie's body had been in the woods ever since she disappeared.
I was able to tell the police how long each bone had been there and how long ago it had been moved, because the bones were moved around by animals, you see. There was no doubt in my mind, really, that she had been there since the early spring.
How Millie was killed remained a mystery.
The degree of change that the body goes through after death, particularly in the sort of timescales we're talking about with Millie Dowler, really hinders what the pathologist can see, what the pathologist can say. It doesn't mean that there's nothing we can see or say, but clearly the less we have to work with, the more difficult it is.
One likes to be objective, one likes not to think of the remains as a person, one likes to to just look for the evidence and you try to be objective. And then, of course, they take you into a scenario where you become fairly emotional. Well, you can't help it. It's an emotional sort of scenario. And then it comes a bit of a shock, really.
The police had no suspects and no forensic evidence. And just 5 months after the discovery of Millie Dowler's body, only a few miles from Walton-on-Thames, another young woman was murdered. At around midnight on the 3rd of February 2003 in Kingston, London, 19-year-old Marcia MacDonald caught the bus home after a night out at the cinema with friends. It was the last time they would ever see her. Walking home, Marcia was attacked from behind less than 100 yards from her parents' front door. Colin Sutton was one of the lead detectives with the Metropolitan Police at the time.
Well, Marcia was found on the street where she lived, 10 or 15 doors down from her parents' house. Local resident heard a noise, heard a whimpering, if you like, and called police, and she was found there with this terrible head wound, and she was taken to hospital and died 2 or 3 days afterwards. Marcia was killed with a single blow to the back of the head with a heavy implement.
Forensic evidence suggested the weapon used was most likely a hammer.
Hammers are effective striking tools, so it's no great surprise that you can cause very severe damage to a human skull with relatively little effort with an effective hammer. You'll often see lacerations, they're often curved to match the profile of the hammer, and you'll often see skull fractures. They're quite often depressed, so pushed inwards towards the brain, because the hammer is exerting its force so focally.
Nightfall and detectives in Hampton still work on, but though they've searched tirelessly all day, they remain baffled as to who carried out this apparently random attack.
Often these things happen and are carried out by somebody the victim knows. In this case, I'm sure police looked at boyfriends, family members, but very quickly ruled out any kind of suspect like that. So it soon became obvious that this was a stranger murder, and those are very rare. So very soon, very quickly after Marcia's murder, people in the area became very concerned that there was a killer on the loose.
Subsequent investigations led police to a mentally unstable 16-year-old who wasn't competent enough to be charged or even interrogated about the incident.
And as a result, he was sectioned and was put into to some sort of institution compulsorily. And although he hadn't been charged with the offence, everybody kind of thought, well, it was him, and so we can put that offence to bed, and you know, we've solved that, if you like.
But then investigators noticed a possible link to similar attacks that had happened in the area in the months before.
There was another 16-year-old schoolgirl that she was thought at first to have slipped over in the snow and banged her head, and it was only then when Marcia was murdered that police looked at this occurrence some 2 months previously and realised that that could have been an assault as well. And they went back to this girl who'd been treated in hospital and were able to talk to hospital staff and look at the description of her wounds and some photographs and conclude that the likelihood was that she too had been attacked but had survived. We found a couple of other offences as well. Again, young ladies had been attacked in the street and hit over the back of the head, and in both these cases they'd survived.
However, none of these other victims were able to identify the attacker.
They just, said I was walking along, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in hospital some hours or some days later. So we didn't have any kind of clue or sighting that led us towards the suspect for it, because they just simply couldn't remember it.
All of the attacks seemed to be totally unprovoked. Could they all have been committed by the same perpetrator, the man who murdered Marcia MacDonald? By joining the dots, Colin and his team could link Bellfield to another vehicle, the car that ran Kate Sheedy down.
And one of the times that he was arrested, was in May 2004 when he was arrested for kidnap, which was kidnapping the landlord of a pub near where he lived in West Drayton. And nothing happened about it, and the landlord in the end said, oh no, it was just a prank that went wrong, don't worry about it. Didn't want to press charges, no charges were brought. But the crucial thing was that that arrest took place, and that abduction took place indeed, in a vehicle, and that vehicle was a white Toyota Previa. Kate Sheedy had been attacked in Isleworth, not by being hit across the head, but by being run over by a large vehicle. And she said that this vehicle was something like a Ford Galaxy. Of course, that's exactly what a Toyota Previa is.
The white people carrier, that was actually on my drive about 2 weeks before he ran Kate Sheedy over with it, only because he asked me if he could leave it there for a couple of nights, and I begrudgingly said yes.
And he got somebody to go and do a check on the number plate of the Previa that Levi had been arrested in, and I remember her saying to me, Governor, I think we might have hit the jackpot, and said it was white. We now had somebody, Levi Bellfield, who had the right kind of white van that was used at the time Amélie Delagrange was murdered, and the right type of vehicle at the time that Kate Sheedy was run over.
Bellfield was now the prime suspect. At dawn on the 22nd of November 2004, police raided his West Drayton home.
In the attic is a naked Levi Bellfield. He'd covered himself up in the hope that no one would find him. Well, they did, and indeed the sergeant got him down and duly handcuffed him.
Of course, he said to us, oh, I was only hiding because I thought it was a gang, I thought it was somebody after me. Well, it was somebody after you, Levi, but it was the murder squad.
On May the 27th, Robert Lee Yates Jr. was born in Spokane and was raised in the small town of Oak Harbor, Washington.
Robert Lee Yates' father worked on a local naval base. He was a blue-collar worker. He had a very close relationship with his father. I think he idolised him. And his father was a coach for a Little League baseball team.
Yates's time at school was very normal.
Robert Lee Yates Jr. played baseball at school, but he wasn't the star on the team. He was good at his schoolwork, but he wasn't the smart person in the class. He was just average. So there was nothing that stood out. There was nothing that said that this family would be the family that would produce a serial killer.
To the outside world, the Yateses were a happy, contented, all-American family.
In many ways, Yates's relationship with his father was completely normal. Usually it's thought that even one positive role model is sufficient to stop people from becoming seriously psychiatrically disturbed, and yet it didn't do anything here. We have to ask ourselves the question, why?
When investigators dug into Yates' family history, they discovered something shocking.
We learned that his grandmother killed his grandfather, and there was some violence in the family, obviously.
His grandmother didn't just kill his grandfather, but she killed him in a especially gruesome way. She took an axe to him, actually. And then was committed to a mental institution. And that becomes, I suspect, an intergenerational message, which is women are very dangerous. They have what you want, but they're very dangerous people.
While there was a violent history in the family, Yates himself allegedly suffered some trauma when he was just 6 years old.
We often find in serial killers that violence is actually rooted in shame. That shame is often something that has happened during the childhood, something that the child felt they had no control over, but something that they felt judged by, something that made them feel less worthy. Robert Lee Yates was sexually assaulted by another child who was a neighbour.
But Yates kept the assault a secret. The incident was never reported to police. After graduating high school, Yates met his first wife. In 1972, aged 20, Yates and his wife moved to the small town of Walla Walla in Washington state, where they enrolled in college. There he spent his free time alone in the woods, hunting, hiking, and fishing. On July the 13th, 1975, a 23-year-old Yates was practicing shooting targets just outside town near Mill Creek when he came across two students. Lifelong friends Susan, aged 22, and Patrick, aged 21, were having a picnic.
This was an area that he knew quite well. It was out in the middle of nowhere, and he was fairly confident that he wasn't going to be disturbed. And it wouldn't surprise me if he'd been fantasizing about this for quite some time. And he comes across 2 college graduates, and he decides that he's going to kill them. And that's what he does. He literally shoots them in cold blood.
A rage burst out. He acted entirely instinctively and shot them both. It is unimaginable. Why would you do that? There is something profoundly out of kilter in Yates's personality. He was intent on killing, and intent on killing prostitutes. He would target prostitutes, perhaps because they were easy, perhaps because no one would miss them.
In 1997, Yates joined the Army National Guard, hoping to become a helicopter pilot.
We have him entering yet another career that involves him enforcing the law. So this is something that enables him to continue having that power and that control and that status.
But Yates's flying career was quickly put on hold as his medical results were being processed.
He's grounded, he's not allowed to fly his helicopter. Now, this is a pivotal moment for me because somebody else has taken control, somebody else has made that decision. He's not the one that's in the driving seat anymore.
Despite not initially being able to fly, he remains in the National Guard. But with a large family to support, he takes on a menial job at a manufacturing plant in Spokane. And all the while, Yates continued to kill.
I think the murders that he committed were an attempt to get back control. I think there were things happening in his life that he felt were out of his control, and he wanted to feel powerful again.
His new hunting ground was the seedy strip in downtown Spokane, known as The Track.
Prostitutes to Yates were easy targets in that they would get into his vehicle without any questions asked. They would just decide upon what money was going to be exchanged for services. And the prostitutes were very vulnerable because most of them were drug addicts, and they'd sell themselves for money and use it to buy drugs.
Robert Lee Yates was very much a regular face on the sex workers scene in this part of town at the time. So he wouldn't just pick up women to have sex with, he would do drugs with them. He became part of their community. And I think he would be trusted by them. He was somebody that they knew.
In the summer of 1997, Yates picked up 20-year-old Heather from the downtown track to have sex with her.
But I suspect that the victims may not have known even the second before they died that this was going to be a killing. Because I suspect their interaction went down much as an interaction with a prostitute goes down. And then when he was done, he draws his gun and he shoots.
Yates shot Heather in the head with a .22 caliber handgun.
Literally, there's just a second that the victim becomes aware that something's amiss, and after that, the victim is dead.
After Yates murdered Heather, he dumped her body on the side of the road.
Well, he was brazen in his thought as far as dumping the bodies.
In August that year, Yates was back on the track looking for easy prey. He picked up 16-year-old Jennifer. Like the young woman before her, her fate was a foregone conclusion.
Unlike many serial killers, the way that Yates kills is instrumental. He has sex with his victims, and then he pulls out a gun and he shoots them. They die virtually instantaneously at the hand of somebody who knows how to use weapons effectively. He's not trying to torture, he's not trying to terrorize, he's simply eliminating the witness.
He watches as the life literally drains from them. And this is an individual who's not going to stop because his offending is getting worse. It's becoming more sadistic.
Once dead, Yates prepared to move Jennifer's body, a ritual he would repeat time and time again. Jennifer Joseph had been murdered 2 years earlier, and her body was found in an alfalfa field northeast of Spokane.
The detectives meticulously took the Corvette apart And in that process, they found a small button that matched the kind of button that was on the clothing worn by Jennifer Joseph. They then knew that Jennifer Joseph had been in that vehicle prior to her death.
Investigators also found a number of bloodstains. When tested, they revealed DNA belonging to Jennifer.
They knew that her murder had been in that vehicle before she'd been dumped in a field northwest of Spokane.
All of the evidence is starting to match up, and it leads them right back to Robert Lee Yates.
The task force put in a warrant for Yates's arrest.
By the time the detectives get a warrant for his arrest, they were 100% certain they've got the right man.
On April the 17th of 2000, the task force put Yates under 24-hour surveillance.
The police had staked out the family home, made sure that he was there, and after he left for work at 6 o'clock the following morning, they moved in and they arrested him.
The same day, detectives searched Yates's house for further evidence. Immediately after his arrest, a sample of Yates's DNA was taken and compared with samples collected from a number of murder victims found between 1996 and 1998.
It was tested that day and came back late that afternoon. I recall that we were at the Yates home conducting a search when we got word that the DNA matched Robert Yates. At least 8 of the victims had the same DNA found on them, so we knew we were dealing with a serial killer. All investigators were very happy. We were actually elated.
The day after Yates was apprehended, a newspaper report was released detailing his arrest. Upon seeing it, former sex worker Christine Smith instantly recognized Yates as being the man who shot her in the back of his van in August of 1998. At the time of the incident, she thought she'd been stabbed and had reported it to police.
It wasn't until a couple of years later, when she was involved in a car wreck, that she went to the hospital and they discovered shrapnel in her head. And then she realises that she's actually been shot. She hasn't been stabbed. Somebody has held a gun to her head and pulled the trigger. And not only that, this person who's done this is Robert Lee Yates, and she realises I could have been one of his victims.
Christine's evidence helped connect the final pieces of the puzzle.
Her coming forward was very crucial to the task force. She came forward, provided the information to law enforcement, and she was a living victim, if you will. It's a living person that could testify against Robert Yates.
A month later, in May of 2000, investigators meticulously searched Yates's black van. They discovered blood pertaining to 2 other victims, 3 bullet holes and spent bullets and bullet debris containing Christine's DNA.
When the task force finally got to her, they had the bullet fragment surgically removed, and it ballistically matched up to the same weapon that was used in some of these other killings.
While searching Yates's property, investigators discovered the murder weapons.
He used handguns. Some of the victims may also have been killed with a .22, but most of the murders were committed by a .25 caliber handgun.
The task force now had enough evidence to charge him with a total of 13 murders and the attempted murder of Christine Smith. This killer's story begins in 1954. Danny Harold Rowling was born in Shreveport, Louisiana on May the 26th. His 20-year-old mother fell pregnant almost immediately after the couple married, much to his father's disgust.
Danny Rowling was the son of a policeman, but he wasn't a very compassionate policeman. In fact, he was a violent and abusive father.
For the rest of Danny's life, his father would refer to him as an accident that should never have happened. He had a violent temper, and almost anything young Danny did was able to ignite it.
If he didn't breathe properly, he was beaten by his father, that the slightest thing would set him off. And I think if we look at that now, we'd call that coercive control now. We'd call that the kind of behaviour that is designed to chip away at somebody's self-esteem, that really does destroy someone's identity.
Time after time throughout his childhood, Rowling was told by his supremely arrogant father that he was useless. He was a useless piece of work and never would amount to anything.
15 months later, Rowling's mother would fall pregnant again and gave birth to her second son. She would continually try to protect the two boys from their father's destructive influence.
His mother flees several times, taking him and his younger brother. They get away from his abusive, domineering father, but she soon goes back to the home. So you've got this constant toing and froing, this constant state of upheaval, and this creates an environment that isn't safe, that isn't secure.
To add to Rowling's insecurity, his mother, his only form of stability, was struggling with mental health issues. Despite him needing her, she wasn't always around. Still a young child, Rowling's existence became a solitary one. He would hide in the woods or wander the neighborhood to escape the constant abuse from his father.
He would go out at night when his parents didn't know about it, and he would look through the windows of the neighbours' homes and he'd see them around the kitchen table, around the dinner table, happy families all together. And he's got that building resentment. Why have these people got this when I haven't? What's wrong with me? And that's something that continues to bubble away in the background.
Rowling yearned for a normal family, the kind of home life that everyone else appeared to have. The suffering at the hands of his father, coupled with his mother's mental instability, sent him on a downward spiral.
Now, the impact this had on quite a suggestible child was severe. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that Rowling's father made Rowling into a serial killer, but there was no doubt at all that there was a very great deal of animosity between father and son.
As a teenager, Rowling continued to escape his home life. He spent even more time wandering the neighborhood, and around the age of 13, his innocent childhood pastime of watching families became sexually motivated.
Rowling had a habit of stalking people, and he would watch them. That voyeurism that had developed during his early years, when he'd looked through the windows of the happy families in his neighbourhood and had that simmering resentment, turned into something else. It turned into something quite sinister.
Rowling took a particular interest in watching young women. He was caught several times and began to get a reputation as a peeping Tom. His life had now started on a destructive path of crime.
It was that classic serial killer pattern. Petty crime, small offences, gradually escalating into greater and greater offences.
By now, he'd started drinking heavily. In 1971, aged 16, a drunk Rowling had a fight with his father, and he was locked up for 2 weeks in a juvenile detention centre. Armed with his K-bar combat knife, once he arrived in Gainesville, Rowling set up a makeshift camp in the woods.
He was a vagrant, a bum, if you like, but he had a purpose. And his purpose was a very particular kind of victim.
Danny primarily targeted young women, and they were always young brunettes like his former wife had been. I was always struck by the fact that, for the most part, his victims were of a type.
On the 23rd of August 1990, new roommates Christina Powell and Sonia Larson were preparing for the beginning of the fall semester at the University of Florida.
They're 17 and 18 years old. They're freshmen. This is the start of an exciting period in their lives.
Someone else was enjoying their excitement too. That evening, they caught the attention of Danny Rowling.
And he's watching them through the window. He can see them giggling along together, having a nice time, washing the dishes. You can just imagine the kind of conversations they're having about the things they're excited about at university.
Rowling has been watching them. In fact, he's probably spent the best part of the night outside in the woods just behind the apartment block. In the early hours, he breaks in. He used very specific equipment, a screwdriver to get in through a sliding door that most of these girls had, and a K-bar knife, which he also used. Those two elements were his signature.
Rowling found Christina asleep on the couch downstairs and Sonia in bed upstairs.
So he's decided that Christina is the one that he wants. So he gets Sonia out of the way first.
He leaves Christina Powell asleep on the couch and creeps upstairs and attacks Sonia Larson while she's asleep. He puts duct tape over her mouth to prevent her screaming and also, of course, to prevent her waking up Christina, who's asleep downstairs.
Rowling stabbed Sonia repeatedly until she was dead. He then made his way back downstairs to Christina, who was still asleep on the couch.
He wakes her, puts duct tape over her mouth to prevent her screaming, tapes her hands behind her back, and proceeds to cut off her clothes and underclothes and rape her with a knife to her throat. He then turns her onto her face and stabs her 5 times in the back. It's an act of the most grotesque wickedness.
As with his first female victim, Julie, in Shreveport, Rowling washed and posed his victims.
The gun used in the bank robbery had been sold to an individual who had a missing finger, and one of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement agents stood up and says, "Holy shit!" And the whole room falls silent. And he proceeds to explain that during the crime scene investigation of the first murders of Christina Powell and Sonia Larson, that they found a piece of paper towel on the counter in the kitchen. On one side was the imprint of a man's penis, as if he were wiping himself off after conducting a sex act. On the other side of the paper was a handprint with a finger missing. And it was at that point that everybody realized the bank robber is the murderer. The problem is, we still didn't know who that was.
Once that connection had been made, the crime lab began re-examining other exhibits from the Woodland campsite in connection with the student murders.
Among the elements of significance were a ski mask whose fibers matched the duct tape found at the third murder. Krista Hoyt's pubic hairs were found on Ronning's sleeping bag at the campsite. Blood on a pair of his trousers was found to be Manny Taboda's. A screwdriver was found which matched the marks on the sliding doors by which he got into the apartments. But the most significant, perhaps of all, was there was a series of audio tapes.
In these disturbing recordings, Rowling alluded to the horror that he was about to unleash.
I know I'll have to run the rest of my life, but I'm getting pretty good at it. I'm a big boy. I can take care of myself. We're all down here for just a breath anyway. Well, I'm going to sign off for a little bit. That's something I gotta do.
As more details of the Gainesville killings emerged, police in Shreveport, Louisiana, realized that there were significant similarities between these cases and the unsolved murders of the Grissom family in 1989. They suspected all 8 homicides may be connected, but the identity of this serial killer remained a mystery.
After a period of time when it became evident that the murderer had either left Florida or had been arrested because no further murders had been committed that matched that MO, a decision was made to test the DNA of all inmates in Florida who had been arrested between, I think it was like a 3 or a 4 month window. Anybody who had been arrested during that time frame was going to have their DNA checked against the DNA on the homicides.
Danny Rowling was in jail pending the trial for the armed robbery of the grocery store in nearby Ocala. So he was on the list to have his DNA checked against the killers. He also had a partially missing finger on his left hand.
They obtain his profile, and lo and behold, they match and they've got their man.
On the 24th of January 1991, as a result of DNA testing, Rowling became the prime suspect in the Gainesville student murders. Brian Jarvis was a sergeant covering major crimes in Marion County, where Rowling was brought in for questioning in connection with the murders.
When Danny walked into the interview room, he was shackled. He had a lot of anxiety. His left leg would tap, it would shuffle. He would be scratching his leg or picking lint off of it. In fact, there was 1 or 2 points there where the detective offered to show him the photos of the crime scene. He said, I want to make sure you know what we're talking about here. And Danny couldn't look at him. He turned his head away and he reacted. He said, I don't want to see that.
On September the 18th, 1991, Danny Rolling was convicted for 3 counts of attempted armed robbery and 2 counts of aggravated assault on a law enforcement officer. He was jailed for life. Finally, 2 months later, Rolling was indicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder for the atrocities in Gainesville. This killer's story began towards the end of the Second World War. Trevor Joseph Hardy was born on the 11th of June 1945 in the working-class suburb of Newton Heath, North Manchester. It was the beginning of a troubled childhood for Trevor.
Hardy's father was quite strict. He had some quite rigid rules around morality and that kind of thing. And if you look at Hardy's behaviour, he starts misbehaving quite early on. He starts rebelling against those rules, against those boundaries.
It is in that background of poverty, he got a reputation. He was, although he was short, he was nevertheless afraid of no one and would fight anyone.
At the age of just 8, young Hardy first started getting into trouble at school. His teachers wrote damning reports to his mother about him bullying his fellow classmates. Even at home, Hardy was an unruly child. He often escaped the family house to roam the streets.
So he's bullying, he's intimidating other children, he's being violent towards others. So right from the outset, from a really early age, he is breaking the rules. So here was somebody who was pretty feral, to be honest.
This was a kid who from the earliest moments was showing signs of a complete lack of connection with other human beings and with a complete lack of connection with the concept of social right and social wrong.
Hardy's mother believed she had an explanation for her son's violence and aggression. In his early years, he suffered a life-changing blow to the head.
Just a sliver of bone was broken off from his skull and moved nearer to the brain itself. And she suggested, and other people have suggested over the years, that that could have had an impact on his violence and his violent temper.
His family certainly thought that when a sliver of bone from his skull had pressed on his brain, it altered his behaviour, it made him more aggressive. Certainly, damage to the brain can alter behaviour, often quite radically.
By his teens, wild child Trevor Hardy was racking up an extensive criminal record. At the age of 15, he was arrested for theft and burglary and convicted for a string of more than 20 offences. The judge who presided over his case ruled that despite his age, he should receive a 12-month jail term in a bid to protect the public.
He was the youngest person ever to be sent to prison. He was in Strangeways at 15. That is a kind of unruly, uncontrollable young man he was. Violent man, worrying really that he could get through the system and operate like he did.
Well, there's no question that Hardy, as a young man, terrorised his local neighbourhood by the weight of burglaries that were going on, and they all knew it was him. So when he went into jail, they could open their doors again because he was just a prolific burglar, and everybody knew who it was.
But Hardy, the teenage tearaway and housebreaker, would soon tread a more sinister path of crime.
One of the characteristics of many serial killers is they begin by petty crime. And it escalates. I think he was set on murder from an early age.
July 1975, 18-year-old Wanda Scala was making the short walk back to her house in Moston after finishing her evening shift as a barmaid in the local Lightbound hotel. Hardy sprung his surprise attack barely a mile from Wanda's home. But his method was different from his first victim.
This time it wasn't a knife. This time Hardy hit her, I suspect from behind, with a brick.
She'd been hit with a brick. It was awful. It was somebody who took pleasure in inflicting that kind of injury. Totally unnecessary, really. Hardy said that it was a robbery. But no, that was more than a robbery. It was an horrendous, brutal attack on a young female.
After strangling Wanda, Hardy subjected his victim to yet more gratuitous violence.
He began to mutilate her body. In particular, he bit off her right nipple before he dragged her onto a building site.
Biting is often another act of cruelty. It's not related to the death. I think it suggests a degree of rage. It's clearly orientated towards the sexual aspects of the body. And to actually bite someone's nipple off, the amount of force you have to put on your teeth is incredible. This is a huge amount of violence for violence sake.
Hardy had now joined the ranks of other sadistic killers throughout history, including Neville Heath, a 1940s murderer he'd read about in prison. He too had bitten off the nipples of his victims. Police were alerted early next morning to Wanda's body, half buried on the building site. They were baffled by the depraved nature of her injuries.
We knew that she had had her right nipple bitten off, which was most certainly an unusual form of injury for any kind of murder.
He hadn't just done that. He hadn't just hit her once with a brick and strangled her, because he'd also then proceeded to absolutely to destroy her face, to crush it, so that her jaw was dropping off, that she was utterly destroyed.
Police felt this was the work of a monster. Not only had she been sexually assaulted, the frenzied blows to Wanda's head had shattered her skull. Even experienced murder detectives were shocked by the brutal nature of her injuries.
Horrific head injuries wasn't on Wanda's scala. She was, her private parts had been kicked. She had horrendous injuries. I've seen photographs just beyond belief, really.
The community was shocked and horrified by Wanda's brutal death. Many young women were now living in fear. In the days that followed, the police ran appeals in the press for information to help catch the killer. Details of the crime scene were reported in newspapers. Wanda's handbag had been taken. Police revealed that one of her shoes was missing, believed stolen by her murderer. Hardy began to enjoy his newfound status as a killer and decided to get involved in the investigation in his own sick way.
Hardy actually takes one of Wanda Scala's shoes back to the crime scene. Now, he's having fun here. He's playing with the police. And you often find this with individuals who have psychopathic traits and behaviours. They like messing with people.
Now been identified as the man wanted in connection with the violent sex attack in the pub.
Well, now, Manchester Police have a much clearer idea of what's going on. Now, this puts Hardy firmly in the frame for the murder, and Hardy disappears. He takes off, realising that this is going to be the police's view.
With Hardy now on the run, police made desperate efforts to track him down, but he had vanished. Weeks later, though, there was a breakthrough in the hunt for Hardy. Detectives had a tip-off that his girlfriend, Sheila Farrow, was signing on for welfare benefits at a job centre near Hardy's home. By tracing his lover, police hoped she'd lead them to the killer.
Sheila Farrow signed on at the social of Failsworth. I think it was a Thursday. After we learned it was actually the following day she was signed on. So a rather rushed surveillance operation was put together. And we found and traced Sheila at the place.
Hoping to follow her to Hardy, police kept a close watch on Sheila and tracked her every move.
We then followed her By hook or by crook, we followed to Stockport, and she went into a house on Wellington Road. And we surrounded it.
Believing they'd finally found his hiding place, it was now or never for Ian Kirkpatrick and his team of detectives. Trevor Hardy had brutally killed 3 young women, and he was wanted for the violent attack on another. Police had to make their move, and fast, before the beast of Manchester broke loose once again. With no time to lose, police entered the building. They had a surprising helping hand from the woman who'd been protecting him.
Sheila Farrell let us in, and when questioned, have you seen Trevor? She's saying, no, he's not here. But she was in fact pointing to the hole in the roof, basically, the loft. And she kept saying, no, he's not here, but pointing upwards at the loft. And we went up, and the loft was opened, and up there was Trevor.
As police blocked the attic, he had nowhere left to run. Trevor Hardy was finally, once again, within their grasp.
That is probably the highlight of my career, was we looked up the trap door and somebody shouted, come down, Trevor. And he said, I'll come down if you don't hit me. For somebody who was so violent towards females, beyond belief.
With Hardy safely back in jail, his lover seemed happy to tell all.
Hardy's story begins to unravel when Sheila Farrow, his girlfriend, tells the police that actually he wasn't in bed with her when Wanda was killed, nor could she give him an alibi for the night that Sharon Mossop was murdered, the girl that's just been killed. So effectively, Hardy, now, he's clearly looking at a very long period of imprisonment.
Trevor Hardy was charged for the murders of Wanda Scala and Sharon Mossoff, though he denied any involvement. But in August 1976, whilst on remand in Strangeways prison, he dropped a bombshell. He confessed to the killings. Hardy also had another surprise up his sleeve. He admitted to murdering another girl 2 years earlier. 15-year-old Janet Leslie Stewart had been an unsolved missing person case that police had never been able to crack.